I signed the divorce at 10 a.m. 5 minutes later, at 10:05, I canceled 15 credit cards. The pen felt ordinary between my fingers. The paper was the same weight as any other document I'd signed in my life, and the room smelled faintly of coffee and old leather. The lawyer said simply, "This makes it official." I nodded. I slid the pen back into its holder, stood up, and walked to the corner of the office where my phone sat on the small table. There was no drama in the movement, no deliberate flourish. The day had been built of small, deliberate things for months. This was only the last one. If this sounds familiar, if you've ever had to decide between spectacle and structure, leave a comment below. I'd like to know you're here. We didn't end with a fight. We ended, if anything, with a series of silences that grew louder the longer we ignored them. Years of travel for him, of "I'll call you later" that meant nothing, of weekend meetings and business dinners that were always urgent and never explained. I learned to read the small notes of absence, the abrupt text, the auto-reply email, the couch left cold on Sunday mornings. Those absences weren't only emotional. They reached into the ledger, into the accounts where we kept our life arranged. He had cards issued on our joint accounts. He had permission to spend, to swipe, to tap. I managed as much as I could, because someone had to. Bills, mortgages, property taxes, the invisible list of things that keep two lives running under one roof. I did it, quietly, methodically, without complaint. That's important, not because I'm boasting, because people assume that the one who manages the structure is someone who can't walk away. They confuse steadiness with dependency. They confuse responsibility with permanent obligation. I am measured by choice, not by habit. I handled the finances because I wanted our life to be stable. I paid more attention to the numbers because numbers don't lie in the way words do. Numbers are a ledger. They keep a score that can be verified, clarified, and corrected. For a long time, I used that to keep us afloat. I had to accept eventually that the ledger alone could not fix what had eroded in the quiet between us. He loved displays. He loved grand moments in the sense of being admired. He loved the idea of a spectacle that announced loudly that everything was fine. I wonder if, standing under the lights of a celebration, you ever see your own reflection first. I did not need that reflection. I needed reality. There were warnings, little things friends said in hushed voices at dinner parties, a message forwarded with a screenshot of a dress he'd liked, a mutual acquaintance's offhand comment, "Oh, they're getting married." At first I treated them as gossip, the kind you discard because you don't want to be the person who believes the rumor first.
Then the invitations began to arrive, not to me, but in the small public spaces that announce life. A photograph, a tagged picture, a comment beneath a portrait. It was $30,000 worth of celebration, we were told later. The number landed like a punctuation mark. $30,000. A figure meant to say, loudly, that this was important, that this union deserved a show. I felt nothing for the expense. I felt something for the implications. $30,000 was an image, not a guarantee. It was an investment in a day's narrative. It didn't change the months of missed dinners or the long stretches of unapologetic absence. What it did reveal, however, was a pattern of entitlement that extended beyond emotion and into economics. If you can authorize a $30,000 wedding without asking the person who helped maintain your life, you can assume you can authorize many other things without accountability. I had not made this decision in a vacuum. I read the divorce agreement with my lawyer a week before. I wanted clarity. What stayed, what left, how access to accounts would be handled the moment the signatures crossed the paper. The lawyer said plainly and kindly that my rights were defined by the documents we'd signed years ago, by the joint ownership, and by the conditions that came with it. There were clauses, there were formalities. None of them were mysterious. They were paperwork and precedent, and most importantly, clarity. That clarity is a kind of shelter. It is not a weapon if wielded correctly. It is a tool. I am not the sort of person who thrives on spectacle. I never advertised my anger or sought a public reckoning. The act of canceling 15 cards was not born from a wish to humiliate. It was born from a refusal to be the person left holding the bill for choices I no longer consented to support. It was a logistical end to a relationship that had already ended in every other meaningful way. So at 10:05, I opened the bank app. I did not narrate my actions. I did not send pictures. I did not compose a manifesto. I tapped the confirmation button 15 times and watched each cancellation appear as a small, unemotional notification on my screen. 15 confirmations, one for each card that had been tied to our shared financial life. Each was its own minor punctuation. Each was proof of an administrative fact. Access revoked, effective immediately. I kept my hand steady. My breathing was steady. It felt in a procedural way, like closing a tap. There are ethical lines, and I was careful to stand behind ours. Everything I did was within the legal rights tied to our joint accounts and the divorce paperwork. I had verified that beforehand. I did not act under confusion or anger that would later be used against me in a courtroom. There would be no stories about how I stole or hacked or cut him off in a way that was illicit. My actions were cleanly bound to documents and signatures.
When someone wonders whether canceling cards is appropriate, there's a difference between sharing a personal account of what you did and giving procedural instructions. I will not give those instructions. I can only tell you what it felt like and why, and what happened right after. What happened first was almost anticlimactic. The world did not shift on its axis. There was no immediate avalanche. Life, predictably, continued. He celebrated under chandeliers. He posted photographs. He drank champagne and was handed a ring. A smile for the cameras. A speech. People clapped. The new partner, young, energized, delighted by the spectacle, stood beside him, the center of a crowd that applauded as if applause could build a future. I watched the images only once, later, not because I wanted to torment myself, but because closure, for me, required sobriety. It was a photo album of a day designed to declare something whole and new. The real test of boundaries often arrives at the most mundane moment, attempting to pay for lunch, to rent a car, to authorize an order. The first refusal happened at a restaurant, on a late afternoon 2 days after the signing. They were at a table near a window. He reached for his card. The waiter slid the machine across. There was a small pause as the device processed the payment. A polite, apologetic tone. "I'm sorry, sir, that card was declined." It wasn't dramatic. It was the machine doing its job. The silence that followed at the table was louder, because people around them didn't know the backstory. A laugh to cover an awkward moment. An attempt to pay with another card. Another decline. Confusion spread like frost over conversation. I should explain that I did not revel in the embarrassment. Rejoicing in someone's public misstep is petty, and it fundamentally misses the point. Those moments were not about spectacle. They were the inevitable mechanical consequence of a legal boundary. If you remove someone's access to funds they no longer have a legitimate claim to, machines will simply reflect what's in the ledger. Declined, denied, transaction blocked. That is the language of numbers, not the language of humiliation. He called me that evening. The call came in ragged, breathless, defensively loud. Usually, when a man calls like that, the voice is layered, equal parts anger, pride, and genuine confusion. He asked where his cards were. He asked why his card had been declined. He demanded to know who had done this. I listened. I said very little. There is a certain economy to words in moments like that. Excess words become excuses, explanations that invite negotiation. I chose to answer one factual question and to leave room for the consequences of his choices to arrive without my commentary. I sent one message. I wrote it carefully, without flourish, for it had to be a matter of record in my own conscience, if not for his. The message read, "The divorce is finalized. Your access to the joint accounts and cards ended when I signed today." I could have written more. I could have pinned a paragraph that laid out all the slights and the long list of absences that had led us to that room. But the point was not to narrate the past. The point was to state a present fact. The rest could be inferred. The rest would play out through banks and statements, and if necessary, through the mechanisms we had both agreed would govern us. The calls didn't stop. He tried the bank. He called mutual friends. He called the new partner. The scene after that was a constellation of small actions. Calls placed, hold music, hurried conversations in lobbies, the frantic attempt to pay with a card that no longer authorized payment. People who had once toasted to his charm now stared perplexed as machine after machine refused him. The new partner had an expression I couldn't place, at once affronted, at once uncertain. The bubble of the celebration had started to show a seam. None of this felt like revenge, and I had to remind myself not to frame it as such. Boundaries are not tools of humiliation. They are instruments of protection. I had built a life that required structure, bills paid, taxes filed, mortgage responsibilities assumed, and I had, for years, met those obligations. When I chose to close access, it was because the reciprocity that justifies shared responsibility had been absent for too long. Shared privileges are only meaningful when there is mutual recognition of shared obligations. There were, predictably, attempts to frame the story in ways that would make me look petty, irrational, or cruel. People like simple narratives.
The wronged woman who lashes out, the bad man who suffers the consequences. I refused those narratives by refusing drama. I refused to write long, angry posts, or to hang my dignity on the exposed ropes of a public argument. My dignity in this case was the day-to-day of a life rebuilt in the small acts that followed. Closing accounts, changing passwords, moving money into accounts in my name, updating beneficiaries and utilities. These were not theatrical acts, they were maintenance. But there is a power in maintenance that is often understated. It is steady, it is effective. You will ask whether the new partner knew. A reasonable question. She knew enough to stand beside him and to accept a bouquet under the lights. She did not know enough to anticipate the immediate consequences of our documents and signatures. She believed perhaps that a wedding buys forward-looking certainty. Weddings can be bought. Responsibility cannot be purchased if it doesn't already exist. That is the dissonance that interests me. The difference between what is purchased for a day and what is earned, day by day. There were moments when people around me expected drama. A mutual friend called and asked gently, "Are you going to make a statement?" I said no. Statements require heat. This was not hot. It was cold, precise. I would not produce a press release about the facts of my life. I would, however, make sure the facts were correct. I would follow the paperwork. I would live in the small, honest acts of regilding. If a story needed to be told, it would be told quietly, with precision. In the days following the cancellations, little things began to change in his routine. The housekeeper's schedule shifted because bills were no longer paid in the same way. A lease on a car was delayed in renewal because the paperwork required signatures that were no longer connected to the same accessible accounts. These are small domestic collapses. They are not sensational. They are practical. They teach a lesson about the difference between image and structure. You can arrange flowers to create an image, or you can ensure the plumbing works when a pipe bursts. I chose plumbing. And yet life is stubbornly ordinary. I did not expect collapse. I expected reorganization. He expected perhaps that someone would run to repair the leaks he had ignored. When that person did not appear, the strain became visible in ways that were not comfortable for him. He began to call people who used to help him. He began to ask favors he had never asked before. There is a humility in that, and an exposure. I do not take pleasure in seeing someone forced into humility. I take note of the reality that accountability is unavoidable when rights and access change. People sometimes ask whether I feared escalation, whether I worried that this would be seen as cruelty and lead to retaliation. We live in a world where financial access is a form of power, where removing access can feel like disempowerment. But there is also a critical distinction between disempowerment and the refusal to enable someone who has repeatedly declined responsibility. The latter is not cruelty. The former is. There was also the private arithmetic of what I'd reclaimed for myself. It wasn't only material. It was the space to plan. It was the quiet afternoons where I could make a list of things for my future and know that they would be paid for by accounts in my name. I changed the beneficiary on a small policy, scheduled a weekend trip that wasn't designed to be photographed for social media, and bought a pair of shoes because I liked them, not because they matched an outfit for someone's toast. These are small acts of self-sovereignty. They are not dramatic. They are necessary. The public learned a version of the story eventually. People exchanged sympathetic messages. "Are you okay?" they asked. "I am," I would say, which was true. I was okay because the things that matter most, the moral shape of my life, my capacity to care for myself, were intact. I had worked to make sure they were. I kept a spreadsheet for a while, not out of vanity, but to remind myself of where I had been and where I was going. It helps sometimes to have paper that reflects truth when memory wants to soften edges.
In the weeks that followed, he appeared less confident. The new partner ceased to share the same bright photographs. The energy of celebration in social circles gave way to small, awkward conversations about logistics and responsibility. No one collapsed into public ruin. No melodrama unfolded. Instead, a slow, mechanical correction took place. Accounts adjusted, roles shifted, expectations renegotiated. I did not want punishment to be the mechanism of change. I wanted correction. People ask whether I felt lonely. Of course I felt lonely sometimes. With loss, even rightful loss, comes a certain emptiness where the familiar used to be. But loneliness and regret are not identical. I could be alone and still know I had chosen the path that best preserved my inner life. That's a different kind of solitude, one that grows into a new shape of freedom. There are cultural elements worth noting here. Women are often taught to absorb discomfort and to smooth edges so that other people can shine. We are applauded for being the steady hands behind a polished table, even when our own needs go unattended. I was raised to believe steadiness was the bedrock of partnership, but steadiness is not the same as surrender. There is a distinction between the person who keeps a household because they prefer order and the person who keeps a household because they feel obligated to compensate for another's emotional absence. I learned that line slowly. I chose, finally, to step across it. Not everyone will agree with how I close the accounts. Not everyone will understand why, in 5 minutes, 15 cards were canceled. I am aware of that. I am also aware that choices are judged by those who imagine they would have acted differently. That is human. My account is only my account. Others will tell other stories. That's acceptable. The important part for me was the moral clarity that accompanied the action. Even now, months later, when I sit with a cup of tea and look at a calendar, I can draw a line between the person I was, someone who absorbed other people's irresponsibility out of a misplaced belief in keeping things together, and the person I have been since the signatures crossed a page. Boundaries have weight. They have practical consequences. They are not punitive if applied with a sense of fairness and legality. They are corrective. There were, of course, attempts at persuasion after the initial shock, phone calls at odd hours, messages that mixed affection with excuses. People tend to assume that once you have made a move, you regret it. They assume the silence that follows is remorse. I wasn't silent because I wanted him to suffer. I was silent because I wanted to live in the consequences of a choice that was not dramatic but necessary. One message, once, that stated the fact. Then quiet. When he left a voicemail that first night, his voice ragged, the edges of a plea showing through, there was a curious clarity to it. He asked, "Can we talk?"
He sounded smaller than he had in years. I kept the message. I listened to it once. It didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me feel resolute. The narrative he wanted to tell, one where he'd been surprised and wronged, did not erase the ledger of absent dinners, missed calls, and assumed entitlements. I don't tell this story to garner sympathy. I tell it because there is a mundane dignity in boundary setting that deserves a modest spotlight. There is also a lesson for anyone who has been taught that patience must be infinite. Patience is a virtue, but not at the cost of your own agency. You can be kind and still insist upon structure. You can be generous and still hold people accountable. Sometime that week, a mutual acquaintance asked, almost apologetically, "Were you worried he would retaliate, that he might make things difficult?" The question presumes that withdrawing permission is an aggressive act. It is not, by definition. It is a refusal to enable continued absence. I answered, "No, I was more concerned about the future than the present. If someone can't hold up their part of the house, I will not prop it indefinitely." The small cascade of consequences continued after that. The car lease renewal took longer, a utility company required reauthorization, he had conversations with bill collectors that were awkward and new for him. People around him began to ask questions that had previously been beneath their notice. Responsibility, when it arrives late, asks for patience people rarely want to offer. It's easy to criticize the one who closes access as cold. It's harder to look at the pattern that made that closure necessary. Several nights later, I dreamed of a house with its lights on and no one attending to the fuse box. It was a domestic anxiety, nothing dramatic, but it mirrored the discomfort of holding a life together alone. In waking, I organized a file, documents, legal papers, statements, so that at any moment I could prove the sequence of choices that led me to this point. There is no romance in paperwork. There is only a kind of quiet armor that prepares you for any misreadings of intent. Even with all that preparation, my action was, in many ways, a single small flash of administrative closure in a long, patient process of disentanglement. The reasons that led me to the lawyer's office were not overturned in a day. They were accumulated over years, in small silences and unattended obligations. The $30,000 wedding was a punctuation mark that announced to the world an image of completeness that private life had already contradicted. I have no interest in tearing apart images. I have interest in aligning image with reality. The story does not end with the canceled cards. That is only the point where I stopped enabling.
The work of rebuilding is now my responsibility, and that work is unsexy.
changing direct deposits, updating passwords, calling the right people, and, when necessary, saying, "I'm sorry, but no," to requests that assume continued access. It is a domestic governance that many overlook because it lacks spectacle, but it is powerful. One evening, about a week after the cancellations, I received a text from someone who knew both of us. It said simply, "Is this true? I saw the photos. I'm sorry." I replied, "Yes, it is true. I'm fine." And I was. Not triumphant, not ecstatic, just steady. That steadiness felt, finally, like an adequate response to years of imbalance. There are still moments when I find myself surprised at how much of identity we attach to another person's presence. You don't always notice that until you're arranging your own furniture in a different light. It can be awkward, at times, to set a table for one and to realize you enjoy the quiet. That is not the same as celebration. It is a recalibration. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, a small paper statement arrived in the mail. It was not dramatic. It had numbers and dates and footnotes. But between the lines, it read like an accounting of truth. Transactions recorded, access ended, balances adjusted. I kept it in the file with the rest of the paperwork. I did not use it as a trophy. I used it as confirmation that the world, which often prefers spectacle, would also accept the quiet language of record and ledger. There are still people, certainly, who whisper that what I did was excessive. 15 cards. They say it like an accusation. Let me be clear. Those 15 cards were extraneous lines to a ledger that I had been maintaining more often than anyone else. They were part of a system that had long allowed him to spend in a way that pretended to be mutual, but was not. The number matters not as a score of cruelty, but as an index of how entitlements stack up over time. Remove 15 permissive channels, and you make the consequences visible. That visibility is not punishment, it is consequence. He tried, in time, to reconstruct his access through other means. There were polite emails and the occasional offer to sort things out. There were invitations to meet, dressed in language that suggested partnership rather than ownership. I declined most of them, not because I love drama, but because once you have lived in the consequence of a choice, you become less inclined to re-enter familiar loops that lacked reciprocity. The new partner, for her part, began to understand the practical limits of spectacle. A wedding can buy you a moment in the sun. It cannot buy you the years of attention and mutual labor that sustain a life. I don't know which aspect of that realization hit her first, the awkward declined payment or the quiet reallocation of responsibilities. But over time, even the most radiant images reveal their practical deficiencies. One night, late, the phone rang.
It was him. He left another voicemail. This time, the voice was quieter, almost apologetic. He said a few things, some of them earnest, some of them excuses. I listened. I did not feel the compulsion to answer. His conversation with himself was, in many ways, the consequence of the ledger I'd set into motion. I let him have the space to find his words without my assistance. There are lessons here that extend beyond any one divorce. Boundaries are not the last resort of the bitter. They are the first tool of people who have learned how to preserve themselves inside a life that demands more care than it gives. Money, in this story, is only the measurable part of that care. It is structure, not status. It is plumbing, not parade. When you choose to cut a thread, do it because you have tried mending. Do it because you value your own attention. Do it because you want your life to be guided by reciprocity rather than spectacle. I did not cancel those 15 cards to make a scene. I did it so that my choices would have consequences, and so that the world, occasionally, would reflect back to him the arithmetic of absence. The story continues after the messages and the declined payments. There are conversations to be had, logistics to be sorted, reputations to be attended to. There are small domestic false starts and adjustments, and the slow, honorable work of building a life that does not depend on someone else's presence to be whole. For now, I keep my file, my cup of tea, and my schedule. For now, I keep the one message I sent, clear, factual, and unemotional. It said what it needed to say. It did not inflame. It set a boundary. He left another voicemail that night. This one was different. The voice trembled at points, not with fear exactly, but with surprise at the unexpected vacuum. He asked where to start. He asked what he should do. The answer exists in the ledger of minutes and signatures, and more importantly, in the slow work he'd neglected for years. I did not deliver that lesson for him.
He would have to learn it in the small, unglamorous moments where responsibility cannot be borrowed for a photo. And yet, even as things rearranged and the immediate shock softened into routine, I found myself looking up at my calendar and thinking about what I would do next. There are trips I intend to take that no longer require the shadow of another's clan. There are small investments in health and in friends, and in a life that is mine to steward. I do not plan a life of self-isolation. I plan a life of reciprocal presence. That is a different aim altogether. The first real confrontation hasn't happened yet. People imagine shouting matches, confrontational scenes in living rooms. The truth is often quieter. The ledger speaks, the machines record. The consequences arrive not with fireworks, but with polite staff telling you your card is declined.
The man who loved displays must reconcile his preference for image with a world that, when given clear boundaries, simply reflects the truth back in ones and zeros. When I close this part of the story, there is an unfinished edge. There are calls unanswered and conversations postponed. There are still small tremors of consequence moving through the lives of people who preferred their burdens carried for them. I have not finished rebuilding my life. He has not finished learning accountability. The new partner is still adjusting the expectations of what a life built on spectacle actually requires. These are slow movements, not theatrical denouements, and so the narrative continues in the ordinary way that most important things do, through persistence, through invoices and statements, and the daily repetition of honest acts. The night after his voicemail, I sat on the balcony and watched a distant light flicker on in an apartment building across the street. It struck me how many individual lives exist behind each window, and how quietly they all tend to their own maintenance. There is a dignity in that, and a humility. There is also a promise that the world will continue to function if we do our part, and sometimes that part requires us to close the taps that others take for granted. I folded the day's mail into my file and closed the folder with the lawyer's stamp visible through the translucent plastic. The action had been taken. The consequences, in various forms, were unfolding. I made tea, then went to sleep, and in the morning the day would begin again with its small list of practicalities. That list would be mine to keep. It would not be dramatic. It would be right. In the morning after, the routine resumed. I went through the motions I had planned. Check the mail, make tea, open the folder with the lawyer's stamp, and put it on the kitchen counter where I could see it without making the day about it. There were practical tasks that required my attention, and I met them one by one. Call the utility companies, update the automatic transfers, move a few funds into accounts that had my name on the title alone, change a password here, correct a beneficiary there. None of it felt heroic. It felt necessary. Weeks became a pattern of small acts that stopped being a list and started becoming life. I scheduled a quarterly meeting with an accountant, someone neutral I could trust to verify that the numbers matched the story I had been telling myself. I made an appointment with a therapist, not because I expected a dramatic unburdening, but because I wanted a steady voice that would help me sort grief from irritation, from relief, from the thin, brittle satisfaction that sometimes masquerades as contentment. Therapy taught me to be precise about emotions, the way I had been precise about bank accounts. Label them, attend to them, do not let them calcify into assumptions. He rebuilt too, in his own way.
That was always the most predictable part of the story. When a structure changes, people adapt. He called people who knew how to help him navigate the new reality. He accepted small favors that would have once soured his pride. He learned the uncomfortable rhythm of explaining why a payment was late. Pride made some things harder. Necessity made other things clearer. There was no public collapse. There was a gradual contraction. Social invitations that had poured in for months tapered off. The photographs that had filled his account with gilded moments became sparser. The new partner's posts lost the same frequency. Small things shifted. I encountered them in the margins. A mutual friend had planned an art opening and sent separate messages, one privately to me, one tagged more publicly to both of them. I chose a quiet entrance. I did not arrive to make a scene. I moved through the room with the same calm I had tried to preserve that day at the lawyer's office. She saw me, and for a moment our eyes met across a crowd of other people's attention. She smiled with the practiced ease of someone who was still discovering her role in a social script. I nodded, not out of contempt, but out of civility. We were two women living parallel, entangled stories. We said nothing more than necessary. There were rumors, as always. People filled blanks the way they always do, fast and with imagination. Some told a simplified tale of cruelty and revenge. Others whispered the narrative of betrayal.
Most did not know what it meant to sit with the pile of paperwork that proves the everyday truth. They did not see the months of autopilot that had allowed him to spend without conversation. They did not remember the nights when I would resort our budget because a mortgage payment had not been scheduled properly. It is easier, socially, to speak in caricature than in the slow sentences of actual life. I let them. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the signatures, a short envelope arrived with a check inside. It was from an elderly relative on his side, an odd, quiet attempt at reconciliation or at smoothing a public friction. I did not cash the check immediately. I considered what it represented, a kind gesture from a person who had been polite to me at family gatherings, an offering that assumed finances could be a bandage. I wrote a note back instead, not long, not an apology, not a request, a sentence that acknowledged receipt and closed the exchange in a tone that matched the rest of my world now, factual, clear, and steady. There were tactical inconveniences for both of us. The car lease required signatures I could no longer provide. The contractor we'd used for a small renovation needed one more authorization. A recurring donation to a charity was linked to an account neither of us had thought to separate. Each of these items asked us to engage with the world in the language of proof and process. I handled them as they arrived, patiently, with files ready.
When he reached out to request a document he'd lost, I sent a scanned copy. Not out of obligation, but because the logistics of a separated life require a degree of cooperation if both parties intend to proceed without drama. At times, people expected me to act differently. "Will you block him?" one friend asked. "Will you go public?" another wondered. The questions presumed a performative justice, that you must enact your hurt in visible ways for it to count. I refused that logic. My measures were administrative, because the problem had been administrative for too long. Absent contributions, absent communication, an accumulated assumption that someone else would always repair what loosened. I did not need to make a spectacle. I needed to be accurate. Financial independence revealed subtler freedoms than I had anticipated. I began making plans that weren't reactionary. I enrolled in a class that had nothing to do with my career and everything to do with curiosity. I scheduled a trip alone. No photos for social platforms, no need to time departures around someone else's calendar. I bought a mattress that suited my sleep preferences and a set of sheets in a color I liked. These items are trivial in isolation. In aggregate, they constituted a small reclamation of taste, decisions taken for the sake of my well-being rather than for the optics of partnership. The narrative at home changed too. Friends who knew me better stopped asking, "Are you okay?" and started asking, "What do you want to do next?" That shift in language marks a different kind of support. Sympathy is brief. Practical questions spur action. I used their offers of help to plan, not to pity. A friend recommended an estate planner. Another who had run small businesses sent me a template for tracking expenses. I accepted help, but I did not abdicate responsibility. This was important to me. Assistance without ceding agency. He attempted to negotiate a few times, not publicly. The conversations were workmanlike. Emails, a formal letter, a request to mediate. In one message, he asked to meet in person to sort things amicably. I agreed to one meeting at a neutral office where a mediator could record decisions. I went because clarity prevents later confusion. I sat at a table surrounded by papers that had once been the scaffolding of our shared life. He spoke in soft, rehearsed sentences. There was apology, there were offers, there was, beneath the surface, a wish to return some semblance of the old convenience he had enjoyed. I heard him, but I did not commit to restoration. I listened. I asked for written confirmations. The formality of the process suited me. There were small surprises in the social response. People who had once credited him for charm admitted in private that they had rarely seen him manage routine obligations. Others were candid with me in ways that felt both liberating and saddening. "I always thought you held everything together," an old college friend said.
I didn't know you were also holding him up financially. There is a particular loneliness in seeing the structural load you've borne acknowledged aloud. It stings. It also clarifies why some acts of boundary setting are bitterly judged. People fear the exposure of their own assumptions about fairness. Conversations with my mother helped. She had been a steady presence without offering easy solutions. "You always kept things tidy," she said over the phone, not as a rebuke but as recognition. "You also deserve tidy returns on the labor you put in." Intergenerational talk sometimes softens the shock of change. My mother, who had been the silent architect of many household rituals, did not offer advice on how to inflict pain. She instead commended me for clarity and suggested practical next steps.
things I mostly already knew but did not always want to perform alone. Support rarely arrives as epiphany. It arrives as neighborly counsel. Months after the signatures, the new partner's social feed had fewer glances of perfection and more mundane images: delivery boxes, a cat lounging on a couch, a plant that looked slightly wilted. I noticed this not out of schadenfreude, but because the image had shifted from curated spectacle to something softer and more real. She began to ask questions in public conversations about how to navigate insurance and vehicle registration. Those inquiries betray a stage many people skip, understanding that the aesthetics of partnership are not synonymous with the practical responsibilities that underpin it. He learned things, I think. I say I think because we seldom have full access to another person's interior education. But when he called asking for the login information for a tax portal, I guided him to the documents that explained the process rather than re-enabling old conveniences. That was deliberate. The goal was not to punish, it was to insist on a new baseline: accountability first, convenience second. There were awkward encounters. At a mutual friend's backyard barbecue, several of the same faces gathered. He was there with the new partner. I accepted an invitation because I value people independently of the histories they carry. We passed each other near the grill. Neither of us made a show. We exchanged a polite greeting. The conversation at my side turned to small talk about the neighborhood and a local market's hours. It was ordinary. I walked away knowing that ordinariness is the terrain where most real change takes place. Financially, I put systems in place that prioritize transparency, not out of paranoia, but because ledger clarity had been the basis of the choice to end a relationship. I set notifications to track transfers, I scheduled regular reconciliations with my accountant, and I kept a simple file system for receipts related to our separation. None of this was punitive, it was prudent. Pride will always make some people uncomfortable with documentation.
I had to resist that cultural nudging towards secrecy. I preferred the quiet armor of clarity. There were also moments of unexpected generosity. An old colleague sent me a book with a note: "For the next months, may curiosity be your companion." The gesture was small, but it mattered. After years of managing other people's time and agendas, to have someone encourage you to choose curiosity felt like permission. It reframed the future as an invitation rather than a tally of losses. Friends with different experiences offered counsel that broadened my perspective. One friend, who had also navigated a long disentanglement, suggested forming a small group where we could discuss the logistics of separation without the sting of judgment. We met once a month in a cafe and traded stories: what to do about shared subscriptions, how to handle mutual acquaintances, how to care for the emotional fatigue that accumulates in paperwork. The group was pragmatic because grief there had long since been normalized into experience. We were not bitter, we were practical. There were voices that suggested I had been cold to cancel those 15 cards. They framed it as an escalation. I would answer them with the same short sentences I had used before. I acted within my rights. I acted after careful consideration. My choice carried consequences. That was the point. The moral calculus that governs interpersonal decisions is not universal. Each account is personal. I understood that some would not approve. I did not need everyone's approval to act within my own code. The new partner reached out once, months later, through a message that began with a tentative attempt at politeness. She admitted confusion. She asked whether it had been her fault. I replied simply, "No, this was not your doing." That sentence warranted clarity on my part, because people sometimes carry collateral shame when they step into roles that are complicated. I didn't want her to absorb blame for something structural. We exchanged a few sentences that were brief and civil. The exchange had no bitterness. It had instead a tacit recognition that relationships intersect in messy ways when responsibility is misaligned. There is an important distinction to be made here. Accountability does not require humiliation. The aim was not to make him pay in public. The aim was to remove privileges that had become privileges of avoidance. He had been allowed to spend without engagement. Removing that permission was not petty. It was corrective. It produced an environment where the consequences of choices had to be faced. For someone accustomed to spectacle, the ledger can be a mirror. At a deeper level, the choice to act was about trust, not the romantic kind, the fiduciary kind. Can we trust that another person will bear their share of the ordinary, unromantic obligations that keep life intact?
When that trust erodes, you can either become the one who absorbs everything, or you can create structures that require reciprocity. I chose the latter. In the months that followed, I met with an advisor, not to teach me how to punish, but to design a plan that supported my future. Retirement contributions were shifted into accounts that reflected my individual goals, not joint assumptions. I diversified small investments. I increased an emergency fund because the reality of life is that it rewards preparation. I did not pursue extravagant purchases. I pursued stability. For someone who had long prided herself on prudence, these measures felt like restoring an old habit to new conditions. Not all changes were technical. I adopted rituals for myself. A weekly dinner with a friend where we would cook something new. A regular yoga class where I could observe my breath without judgment. I rekindled a relationship with reading that was slow and luxurious, books that required more attention than the usual stream of headlines and notifications. These rhythms were an antidote to the centrifugal energy of drama. They taught me that a life rebuilt is a life paced differently. Less reaction, more attention. People sometimes ask whether I regret the lack of a public farewell. They expect perhaps a grand speech or a blazing final post. I have none of that. My closure was administrative, because the problem that preceded it had been administrative, and crucially, persistent. Silence was not ignorance, it was discipline. The only message I permitted myself to send publicly was the one I had sent privately the day I canceled the cards. Succinct, factual, unemotional. That was the milestone. Everything else followed in the everyday. There were small acts of kindness from unexpected quarters. An assistant from a community organization sent a handwritten note thanking me for supporting a local fundraiser years earlier. She had heard of the separation and wanted to check in. Small acknowledgments like that reframed the sense of being part of a community rather than the center of a spectacle. The world continued to be kind in the small, practical ways that matter. Offers to help move furniture, a neighbor watering the plants when I traveled, a friend bringing over soup. Occasionally, I replayed the moments that had led to the lawyer's office, not out of longing, but out of analysis. What were the early signals I misread? Which habits did I allow to calcify into assumptions? It is tempting to search for a single missed beat, a cinematic moment that would have alerted us all sooner. But life rarely offers such clean clues. Instead, it presents a sequence of tiny decisions. Those accumulate. My work in the aftermath was partly about discerning which small choices to change so that the next years would not repeat the same patterns. He reached out one final time, months later, to ask if we could meet to clear the air and to discuss what had been settled.
He suggested coffee. I chose a public place. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. It was civil. He apologized in a way that felt more reconciliatory than performative. I acknowledged the apology. I did not offer absolution. Not because I held out a grudge, but because closure, for me, was an ongoing practice rather than a single exchange. We parted with a handshake. That felt right. There were also moments when the world asked more of me than paperwork and conversation. An acquaintance who had been part of both of our circles asked me why I had not returned to certain social functions. "Is it because you don't want to see him?" she asked. I answered honestly. Partly, but also because I want my presence to be chosen, not habituated by others' expectations. The distinction mattered. Choosing where to be present is an act of autonomy. In time, the attention that once accrued around his events recalibrated. People have short attention spans for other people's long arcs. New stories took their place. New engagements and obligations filled the calendar. Sometimes I felt invisible, and sometimes I felt relieved. Both were acceptable outcomes. I had traded the drama of constant explanation for the quiet of effectiveness. Financially, there were scars that healed into lessons. I learned to spot vague promises masked as casual generosity. I learned to convert vague commitments into signed agreements or refuse them altogether. That kind of clarity can feel cold to people who prefer the warmth of giving without terms. But warmth without terms often covers another kind of cold, the reluctance to acknowledge mutual obligations. There were opportunities too. A local nonprofit invited me to speak about managing transitions, not to explain my personal story in vivid detail, but to discuss the emotional logistics of disentanglement and the practical components of rebuilding. I accepted. Speaking felt strange at first, exposing the scaffolding of my life to a room of strangers, but it turned out to be a form of generosity. People asked questions that were not prying, but pragmatic. We spoke about how to make lists that don't shame, how to separate grief from anger, how to set boundaries that are enforceable and legal where necessary. I maintain the same refrain. Act within your rights, prepare your documents, and do not mistake dramatic displays for durable safety. Months later, when I looked back across the year, the calendar did not contain a single explosive headline about our separation. Instead, it held a series of small checkmarks, forms filed, accounts corrected, a couple of gray hairs plucked out of surprise. The $30,000 wedding remained an image on a feed, a photograph with flattering light that proclaimed an outward wholeness. The ledger, however,
recorded the truths that image could not. Who had been present for bills? Who had been present for bedside medication? Who had shown up at midnight when a pipe burst? The ledger was less glamorous.
It was also more honest. One evening, nearly a year from the day I signed, I received a message from someone I had not heard from in a long time. She had watched the slow and spooling of public and private details and wanted to say simply, "Your steadiness taught me something." The message surprised me. I had not thought of my behavior as a lesson. I had thought of it as necessary maintenance. But the idea that restraint could educate others delighted me quietly. There is a pedagogy in living with dignity. I have no illusions about neat endings. Lives are messy, and people continue to make choices that have unintended consequences. Yet the principle that guided my actions still holds. Structure must follow claim. If you have shared privileges, you must also share obligations. If you are unwilling to do so, you should not be surprised when access changes. That is a fair rule, not a punitive one. Occasionally, I still receive notes asking for advice. Few are about canceling cards, and more are about how to restore one's own boundaries while remaining humane. To those I say, remember that kindness does not require erasure of self. You can be compassionate and still insist upon equitable labor. You can be patient and still set a deadline. The value of a boundary is not just in the moment it is enforced, but in the shape it gives to future days. There was one final practical step I took. I organized a file of lessons learned, not as instructions for others to copy, but as a record for myself. What worked, what didn't, where I had been naive, where I had been too patient. Pages on finances, pages on communication, pages on support networks. It is a private document now, a map I return to when nostalgia or doubt creeps in. The map does not erase the past. It translates it into usable knowledge. If you find yourself wondering whether to act or to wait, consider this. Permanence is not required for prudence. You do not have to live your life at the mercy of someone else's inconsistency to be compassionate. Setting a clear, legal boundary is not necessarily an act of cruelty. It can be a form of courage, the courage to prioritize your ability to continue, to steward your life in full, rather than to keep an arrangement that exacts a steady toll. I am not an example of righteous anger. I am an example of someone whose patience ran out and whose attention turned to repair. The action of canceling 15 cards was not an exclamation point. It was a punctuation that announced the end of permission. The wedding remained a photo. The bills were not paid by applause. There's a quiet satisfaction in that, not in pleasure taken at another's discomfort, but in the relief that follows alignment, when your principles and your actions converge. I sleep better now. My days are less crowded with apprehension. I wake with plans that belong to me. I do not mistake solitude for punishment. I see it as a clearing in which to plant.
I tell this because the cultural expectation that women must absorb burdens remains stubbornly persistent. It will not dissolve simply because one person decides to close a tap. But small examples ripple. People notice how consequences teach lessons. They watch how the machines and the ledgers mirror choices. They begin, sometimes, to ask different questions in the quiet corners of dinner parties and staff rooms and chats between friends. Who is doing the work? Who gets the credit? Who pays the bills? Those are good questions. They are worth asking and answering. I am still building. There will be days of doubt and days of clarity. There will be cross-currents of memory and new joys I did not anticipate. There will be invitations and new relationships that ask little and give much. For now, I keep the folder in a drawer and the single message in my sent box. The message did its job. The pauses that followed were not empty. They were the space I needed to decide what to construct next. If any of this resonates with you, if you've ever had to choose between spectacle and structure, leave a comment below. Tell me what boundary changed your life, or what small administrative act restored your freedom. If you want more stories about building a life with dignity, subscribe and share this with someone who might find steadiness useful. Thank you for listening.